Hi guys, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Can.
Yes, we can.
Yes, again.
Yes.
Okay. Give me just a second. Nineteen, 13. I'm still missing some persons.
I can't hear anything.
I don't hear anything either.
Same here.
Miss
Miss
Moxey,
Moxey,
your
your mic is
audio is
muted.
muted.
That's why I couldn't hear nothing. I keep saying I can't hear nothing. Hey guys,
Hi, Nelly. You look like you living the life, honey.
I wish.
Miss Moxey, your audio is muted.
I wish.
I know, I know what you're saying, honey. Oh, boy. What is
I
happening?
just come on because I got the try.
Okay, hon.
Nelly, all you can hear is your twinkle bells.
That's these things that get hanging up.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Through the computer or through the cell phone?
Mr. Moxey, mic is muted.
You can hear me now, right?
Yes, we can
everybody
hear you.
me?
Yeah, you know.
Thumbs up if you guys can hear me. Awesome, Chanel, thank you. All right, so guys, I do not have a presentation. I noticed I'm still missing a few persons from the session. I'm actually supposed to have 21. I apologize for the technical issues. Hold on just a second. You're gonna come and help me. So I had to borrow my daughter's computer because my computer wouldn't allow me to get on. So this is my little person who has obviously more technical skills than I do. So with that, let's just wait a couple more minutes, just because I see that a few more have joined, and just because also I want to adjust my chair too. But let's just wait about 2 minutes at least, see if anyone else joined. I know a lot of people are on their way home from work. And I just want to make sure that everybody gets the full benefit of the session. So let's just go another 2 minutes and then we'll start. Awesome. All right.
Nelly, are they rim chimes in your car, Nelly?
That's medals.
Oh man, but I love it. It sounds, it has gives it oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, from when I do my various different fun one walks, that's my say that I finish it.
Okay, good.
No more adjusting your camera and driving.
What'd you say, Sha?
No more adjusting your camera and driving.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, guys, let's get started. Thank you for your patience. Glad to see everybody surviving COVID. And I am going to try in this session to do several things. And I guess at the end, we'll determine if we need a little bit more time and maybe set up another session, but I'm going to try and do everything in one because I know you guys have an assignment that's coming up. And what the chapters that I was supposed to do would really tie this all together and help you with your assignment. So that being said, hold on just a second for me. Sorry, I'm experiencing the challenges of working from home with little people in the background talking, so I apologize for that. So I know you guys have an assignment coming up, and with that assignment, the two sections or two units that I was supposed to do pre-COVID hinge greatly on your ability to answer and to address the assignment. So that being said, I'm going to try as I go through to bring the question into perspective, as well as bringing the two modules together so that you guys could have an appreciation for how everything ties in and how you can answer your question. So hopefully, I think that's the best way to approach this in the circumstances. Any questions so far?
Not so far.
Okay, awesome.
So
good.
You mentioned that there would be two chapters we'd be going through. Which two are they?
Right. So technically, I was supposed to do pre-COVID. Let's make sure I have it right now. Module 4, which deals with designing a comprehensive AML CFT risk assessment. Risk-based, well, really that is risk assessment. It says a risk-based approach for a financial services unit. It actually is unit 9 and then units 10 to 11.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yes, thank you.
So unit 10 to 11 would be dealing with the risk basing of a customer and understanding customer due diligence. Yeah?
Yes.
So it's a lot of material in a short space of time. Now it's up to you guys. If we try to do everything, I could summarize it very quickly. Or Chanel, I see you talking, but I don't.
Sorry, hi, Shasta. I just have a very quick question. Under the contents, module 4, sorry, module 3, Ty, give me a second, I'm on the Zoom call. Module 3 has unit 9, which is implementing an AML CFT risk-based approach. And then module 4 has unit 10 and 11. Are they the 3 areas that we're covering?
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay. And they're the ones for which you're going to draw on most of the information to address your assessment, your assignment. Okay?
Yeah.
So just in case everybody has not met me, I think all of you have, but I'm Shasta Moxey, just a little bit background. I am one of the lecturers for the ICA diplomas. That most of you know who do know me. I've been in compliance many years. I won't say how long because I'll be really dating myself here. An attorney by trade who kind of fell into compliance. And so with that, let's get into summing up these units. I think the best way to sum these up is with the first unit that I was supposed to do in that, looking at a risk-based approach. So internationally, the world has moved to a risk-based approach. What does that mean? It means that CFATF, which is really an arm of the Financial Action Task Force, has looked at, has taken the approach that we look at compliance in terms of risk. So that means that we look at all the risks that we have within our operations, and we determine through a process of assessment what those risks may be, one, and two, what level of rating would we give those risks to determine which ones we prioritize. Now, in these chapters, they talk about several types of risk being assessed. And this is where it gets confusing. So the first types of risk that they're talking about is a country assessment, so more on a national level. And so before I go into that type of assessment, so you have a national risk assessment. So you would have a enterprise risk assessment, so where you're looking at all of the risk of your organization, all the risk to your organization. You're going to have a risk-based approach that will probably only apply to money laundering and terrorist financing. And then you're going to take a risk-based approach to your customer onboarding and your continuing monitoring of those customers. So that being said, let's break it all. That's the basic way to break it all down and put this all into perspective. You will find that the first thing they talk about is your national risk assessment. So most countries now have done a national risk assessment where they have looked at all of the risks to the nation as a whole, and from that they then determine what regulations they may need to put in place, what legislative provisions that they have to put in place to mitigate risk, and generally they may have to create new organizations, new regulatory bodies. All of these things help to build out what is a national risk assessment. So when they talk about risk assessment, when they start out about risk assessment in Unit 9, they talk about a country having done a risk assessment. And so most organizations are going to use their country risk assessment to help build out their enterprise risk assessment. Now, why do I distinguish between them? Those who are licensed by the central bank will have had the lovely job of quite recently submitting an enterprise risk assessment for their organization, as well as a money laundering terrorist financing risk assessment. What does that all mean? Okay, so an enterprise risk assessment is going to look at all of the risk to your organization. So in the chapter, they list probably about 10 of them. Let me just get to my chapter here. And so they are looking at anything from, so when you're looking at enterprise risk, you're looking at your operational risk. You're looking at your financial risk, your IT risk, your money laundering terrorist financing risk, for example. You're looking at reputational risk, liability risk, and all of these risk factors are taken into consideration, and you would list them out and look at, okay, what are the factors that in essence will contribute to these risk factors to my organization. And on looking at those factors, I am then going to say, oh, okay, so these are the risks, and how am I and my organization, how are we mitigating or controlling that risk? And that would be through your processes, that would be through your policies, your procedures. Those are the things that you're going to use to mitigate that risk. And then once you have that all in place, you're going to rate that risk to your organization. And you're going to rate that risk, and most people risk rate based on a high, medium, or low tier. And risk basing is more than likely, people, even if they choose 1 to 10, that 1 to 10 is still going to be broken down into sections to what falls into low, what falls into medium, and what falls into high. And likewise, that same approach of low, medium, and high rating is given, or some people would say low, moderate, or high. But in essence, it really all means the same thing. Every risk is rated. And based on that risk rating will determine whether or not there are gaps in your procedures. And what are you going to do to close the gap on that overall risk that you've assessed to your organization? So that's enterprise risk in a nutshell. You will also probably have a regulatory risk assessment, just in case you don't have enough assessments going on there. But most regulators now will risk rate their licensees. So let's use the central bank, for example. The central bank has taken a view on, and most regulators have risk rated their licensees in some way. In that regard, they will determine how often, for example, they would inspect your organization, or they'll come in and do some sort of examination. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure if that was me or somebody else.
I think it was me. I switched from my phone to my laptop.
Okay.
Right now.
All right, awesome. So we'll just wait for you so we don't get the feedback.
Okay, 1 second.
No problem.
All right, should be done. All right, I think I'm good now.
Okay, great. So with that, most of us would have gotten a nice letter where a licensee of the central bank, and it would have indicated how the central bank has assessed us in terms of what kind of rating they have given us, and they've basically done that rating based on the same approach. The underlying principles in risk rating relates no matter how you're risk rating or what you're risk rating, it's going to technically be the same. So your regulator may look at just slightly different factors though. So for example, your regulator look at what are your programs and policies and procedures. What type of business are you operating in terms of what is your clientele, what is your market, what are your products? And based on that, they will determine whether or not your organization is low, medium, or high, for example, and how frequently they will perhaps do an on-site in your organization. So that's I didn't add that in my original 3 kind of risk assessments, but that's, I should say 4 risk assessments. But so there are various types of risk assessments, and this unit kind of covers all of them, perhaps not in the same detail, but they all reference the type of risk assessments that are out there. For example, your regulatory risk assessment of your organization may determine how your correspondent bank looks at you. So a lot of regulators now will issue the licensee with a letter that sets out kind of like their, almost like a report on the organization that's based on your risk, on how they've risk assessed you. And that will oftentimes be used by your correspondent bank in determining whether or not they consider you a high risk, your organization, in terms of what you're doing. And may also eliminate some of the documentation and hurdles that they require your organization to jump through in order to maintain their correspondent relationship with that correspondent bank. And so all of these things, I say all of this so that you can get a picture of how the world is moved into a global risk rating, and how everything technically is now is being risk rated. Then we move into the money laundering, terrorist financing, risk assessments. Quite often, and the reason why emphasis is put on money laundering and terrorist financing is because that's considered one of the major risks now to any kind of organization, any kind of business. And they want to be, and most regulators single that out because they want to make sure that you have everything in place. That's not to say that your enterprise risk assessment isn't going to address your money laundering and terrorist financing. It just isn't going to do it to the same extent that you would in a money laundering terrorist financing risk assessment, which is going to look at all of your money laundering terrorist financing proliferation risks. Now, you know, I like to ask this question because I know everybody knows the answer. So I use that nice word, proliferation. What does proliferation mean? You can actually, somebody volunteer to, because I like to pick on people, I'll let you know. This isn't like my classes where I can't show you guys candy. I apologize. Those who have had me before know that if you answer and volunteer for a question, I will reward you. Unfortunately, virtually, I wish I had some virtual candy, but I'm sorry. But feel free to unmute your mic and explain to me what proliferation means, or you can actually send a note in the chat, whichever one is easier for you. Don't be shy. Don't everybody jump in one time either.
It has to do with weapons of mass destruction.
Yes, exactly. And so a big word for a little phrase, right?
Right.
Teacher, get your tea, sister. Sorry, the problem with working from home is little people. So yes, it's a big word for a little thing. So really, when we're looking at proliferation, we're looking at things like use of technology, chemicals, products for weapons of mass destruction. And so the difficulty with that, somewhat like terrorism, is the fact that very generic things can be used or not thought of to be used in the process of weapons of mass destruction. So let's look from a technological point of view. So the fact that I may be ordering a particular type of computer component could mean that I'm doing something totally unrelated to weapons of mass destruction, but coupled with some other things that may be passing through my business might give us a red flag that my organization somehow may be assisting in someone being able to build a weapon of mass destruction. So this is where we pull in things like sanctions. So I know you guys had Christine, and I think Miss Archer would have dealt with sanctions, if I remember correctly. You guys have finished that. Is that correct? Hello. Nobody did sanctions?
I think that we did touch on them.
Okay.
Yes,
So,
yes, we did.
I thought so. But listen, so this is how you're going to bring this all together. Can you hear me?
Yeah, if I may interject very
Okay.
quickly. In agreement with what Colby said, Mrs. Sands, Farida, she touched on the sanctions part of it.
Okay. All right. So, as you know, the world in trying to stop the production of weapons of mass destruction, and in order to, okay, we may need somebody just to mute their mic because I'm getting some feedback. Thank you. So in order to enforce various resolutions of the UN, country-specific sanctions that may be in an attempt to prevent persons from developing weapons of mass destruction. Right now we have Kim Jong trying to blow up the world, but he's using what may be seen as quite innocuous products that he's buying and purchasing, and nobody links them to his developing weapons of mass destruction. And so oftentimes sanctions are put on industries, maybe put on certain types of products, maybe put on individuals in order to prevent not only terrorism, but in essence, the development of weapons of mass destruction, or even chemical weapons. What chemical may seem might not seem to cause harm in any particular way, when you put it together with something else, could create something totally different. And so I say all of this because in your risk assessment, they want to be able to be sure that you have programs, policies, procedures in place to be able to identify and monitor what your client is doing. And so all of that becomes part of your risk assessment. How effective are those procedures, those policies in one, ensuring that your organization is not faced with any kind of sanctions penalty for failing to pick up that perhaps your client is assisting somebody in developing or using something that they shouldn't be using or shouldn't be purchasing, for example. And so if you don't, what are the controls that are in place to prevent that? And that's really what your risk assessment is doing. Your risk assessment is looking at what your risks are, quite simply what your risks are. What are you doing to mitigate those risks? What have you put in place? What procedures do you have in place? If there's any gaps, you identify the gaps and you give that a rating on whether or not that gap creates a large concern for your organization. I mean, obviously, if it isn't and it's something that you can fix quite easily, that you may rate that low. Or there may be a risk that you just can't because, for example, there may be a third party that's involved, and you may not necessarily at the beginning of a transaction realize, for whatever reason, that you're falling into some kind of relationship where you're facilitating something that you shouldn't. But obviously, this is what risk assessments is all about. And then you have the risk assessment that you would do on your customer. So we will normally, in this world today, would risk rate our clients high, medium, or low. And obviously, how we risk rate and what categories a client falls into, whether it's high, medium, or low, will depend on various factors, which we'll get into in a bit. But obviously, you'll see I did all of that just to be able to draw together how the world has moved into a risk-based approach to everything. And how, when we sit in our organization and we oftentimes feel as if, well, listen, we're the only ones risk assessing here. We're not. Everybody's being risk assessed in some way or another. And all of us may form a part of that risk rating or risk assessment in one way or another. Some of you may work with regulators. So from a regulator's perspective, you know that you're risk rating your licensees, like I said, your regulators or supervisors are actually risk rating you. And then they're looking at how you're doing your risk assessment of your own risk as well as your customer risk. And so this is how we get to risk rating or risk assessments. Any questions? No?
No questions.
Okay, good. We'll just moving right along then. Yes.
Question.
Mm-hmm.
You had, Siobhan Smith here.
Hi, Siobhan.
You had mentioned that there were 4 assessments. I just want you to confirm the 4 assessments. I got the enterprise. Can you just reiterate those for me?
Sure. I think I threw an additional one into my initial risk assessment. So I spoke about your national risk assessment.
Yes.
Okay. I threw in later, and I apologize for that, your regulatory risk assessment.
Okay.
Then you have an enterprise risk assessment. and you will have an AML CFT risk assessment. And when you're doing customer due diligence, you're doing risk assessment on your customer. So technically that's 5 risk assessments that I've just given you.
Okay.
And I say all of that so you could bring, because the difficulty with how they do it in these units, it's hard to bring it all together. And so I find it easier to be able to, if I can't visualize how all of these things fall together, for me, it's difficult to understand what it is that I'm required to do.
Okay.
All right. And so I wanted to give you all that background first, that basis, because if you're reading through these units, you're thinking, okay, so here's one risk assessment. How does this relate to the other risk assessment? And so I did all of that so you could see how they all kind of blend together. But you could understand the reason why they're being done. Okay. Your national risk assessment is being done because why? CFATF, when they come into your country, they want to know how you risk rated yourself. Obviously, they want to be able to know that were you able to pick up some of the concerns that we already have of your country. So let's look at the Caribbean, for example. Most of the countries in the Caribbean are risk rated high for CFATF purpose. Why? Because of several factors that they look at. They looked at our geography risk. As far as they're concerned, we are a transit point for all sorts of things. We're a transit point for drugs. We're a transit point for human trafficking. We are a transit point in terms of persons being able to, what they say is hiding funds. So being an offshore jurisdictions, we're just helping persons to hide money that ordinarily would have been out there if we weren't around. Okay. And so they want to know, and they look at all these things and they risk rate us high. We know this because we've been on quite a few blacklists over the last years. You know, everybody's on a list at some point in time. Right now we're fighting with the EU because they have their own little lists and they put us on a list. We've had CFATF that comes in as part of the arm of the Financial Action Task Force in the Caribbean region that comes in and makes an assessment and do a country risk of us that then others use to risk rate even our institutions, whether we like it or not, right? And obviously our regulator takes into consideration too, how are we being looked at from an international perspective? And that's what the CFATF rating and the EU rating and all these other ratings fall into, how they fall into the picture. And based on how our country's rated will determine how people do business with us. Correct? Whether we like it or not, I mean, some things we can unfortunately influence the way we would like, because we don't necessarily have the might behind us to be able to do it. But I say all of that so you could understand and bring it all together, like I said initially. Bring it together and understand why all of it plays a part in how we're doing business today. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. So everybody got the 5 risk assessments that I talked about, right? Okay, awesome. And the thing to remember is most of them are going to have the same kind of rating of low, medium to moderate is usually the same thing. So you're in the middle, and high. And obviously, based on all of that, most people, if you're in the high risk category, you're going to have to jump through a few more hoops, correct? So even with our high risk customers, we're going to want to do a bit more than we would for a client that we low risk rate, okay? And so it's the same with regulators. They look at this, they look at us. And so for example, inherently, when the central bank risk rates their licensees, there are certain industries or certain, let me give you an example. Trust is considered, can never be really a low risk business channel. And so you will find that most trust companies are going to be in the middle ground. So they're going to be moderately rated. Because as far as the world is concerned, the products that they're offering, while they may be for a legitimate purpose, is viewed as being used to facilitate persons doing all of those predicate offenses that we look at in terms of money laundering. So tax evasion, assisting money launderers and criminals, and you name it, to hide and move their monies and put it into the financial system and the whole 9 yards. So because in terms of global risk rating, they look at that industry itself as being one that isn't low in terms of its risk. A regulator would find it hard then to look at a trust company and then say it's low rated, even though it may have some of the best policies and procedures in place to control that risk. There is always third-party risks that they can't control. And so it's going to be difficult then for a regulator to risk rate a trust company as low, because when you know the international organizations come in to risk rate us as a country, they're going to say, well, I don't see how you're able to do that, because you know they're using these trusts for all sorts of things. And part of that we know is just sometimes just a political agenda, and also a misunderstanding of what the product is and how it is used and how it's controlled. Because we all know for most trusts, the trustee controls the assets. It's very rare that the trustee doesn't know where the asset is going and where it's coming from. But because we, you know, over the years, it has a particular perception, it's kind of difficult to change that risk rating. All right, so, right, so let's get back to the chapter here. And so you'd see I've already covered quite a bit of Unit 9. And one of the things it's looking at too, and so let's start out by doing a risk rating of your organization, because most of you who are in compliance would have been part of that lovely enterprise risk assessment that you did for your organization. So I'm just going to step back here. I would have mentioned that most of the licensees for the central bank, practically all of the licensees for the central bank, would have, as at the 30th of April, submitted 2 risk assessments for their institution, and they're required to do it on an annual basis. Now, I will tell you that some jurisdictions may not even require yet their licensees to do enterprise risk assessments and AML. The world is not equal. The rest of the world is catching up. All right. But most of the countries that are in financial services, their institutions are required to do 2 types of risk assessments. So on the 30th of April of this month, SFIs with the license through the central bank would have submitted 2 risk assessments. Now, the variance in terms of period in which you do those vary from country to country. In the Bahamas, ours is annually, or it may differ based on products, changes that you, delivery channels, any change that you make that could affect the risk of your organization, you're technically required to do a new risk assessment. I know that sounds crazy, but what they really want organizations to do is whenever you have any kind of change in your organization, they want you to go back and look at your risk. How is this new product, for example, that we're taking on, going to affect our money laundering terrorist financing risk? how is it going to affect us in terms of our financial and technological risk, in terms of what processes do we need to put in place? Maybe we need to have some kind of new software to better able to, so we're better able to, one, offer this service to our customer. Two, are we able to control how that service is being now delivered through that software to our customers? Three, how then are we able to ensure the safety of our customers' information through that service, through the use of that technology to provide the service? What are the financial risks? Are we required to then, because of this new product that we're offering, how are we going to be able to, or required to financially keep track of this service or product that we're offering, in terms of, it might mean that we have to provide or add to a financial statement that we're providing for this client. Can our IT facilitate that? Are we able to do that? Do we have to do it manually until we can find an IT solution? That's all a risk to us, because a manual process may mean that we may miss a step. An electronic process may also mean that we can do one part of it. We may be able to see the front end side, but not the back end side of what we need in terms of delivering our requirements or what we're offering to the customer. And so all of these things have to be taken into consideration when we're looking at and assessing how this product is being facilitated through our organization. What are the legal, so for those of you who work in the legal department, what are the legal risks of that product now being offered to our organization? Does it mean that we need to come up with new forms and add to our terms and conditions of business in order to better protect ourselves and customers? Are there regulatory requirements that we now have to go and look at? So, for example, part of that service might mean that we're outsourcing part of that service to a third party. And if that's an outsourcing requirement, then we have a regulatory issue, because first we may need to get regulatory approval to be able to offer this service, because there is a third party involved. All right? And so based on all of that, then we have to look at, okay, we have this new product coming into effect, and we've looked at some of those risks. What then are the policies, procedures, and other controls that we have to put in place to ensure from an operational standpoint that, you know, we can effectively offer this product to our customers safely. We considered all the regulatory requirements, and we can fulfill any regulatory requirements that may be needed. So, for example, not only when you have an outsourcing issue, but we may have an issue by the fact that the regulator may now require us, because we're offering that service, to do several things. One, it may increase our capitalization that we're required. It may, for example, require that we have to do more or a quarterly reporting, or maybe a monthly reporting that we didn't have to do in the past. Are we able to do that effectively so we don't get into penalties and fines by our regulator because we haven't met the requirement? Okay, and all of these things, we then determine how great are the risk of that. And I'm just giving you a small example of just looking at a product that's being offered. How then, what are the risk rating are we putting to all of those? So we may determine that, okay, from a business perspective, and when we're looking at what our forms are in place and what our conditions and conditions of business are, that is a low risk. Why is it a low risk? Because they effectively cover the risk that this product may now present, given that we're now going to offer it. Okay, and so in terms of a business assessment, I always think of it as looking at it like from the purpose of putting together a business plan. When you put together a business plan, you're trying to think about all the things that's going to be affected by you trying to start up a business, for example, right? And risk assessment is the same way. What are the risks to your organization? And that could be something from, for example, there may be a requirement where the customer has to come and collect something from you in order to facilitate an online service that you're offering. So how then is that being managed? You know, you may even have a risk from the security guard not being aware that, certain persons are going to be coming in and they're going to be leaving with certain things. And the security guard may have an issue because he would be like, hold on, how do I know that they had approval to take this out of the bank? I'm just using that as an example, or out of your institution. And so you have to look at all of those risks. And that's why it's important that you not only do the enterprise risk assessment, but why the regulator would also say that you would, for any new product or service that you're offering, they want to be able to see your thought process. Did you look at all of these things? And if you looked at all of these things, what did you determine were the controls that you need to put in place? And there may be certain risks that you decide, from a business perspective, you're prepared to take because with this product comes certain risks, for example, and you're prepared to take that risk. And that might also mean from an operational perspective that you've got to look at an increase to your overall insurance, your liability insurance, or any other kind of insurance that you cover your organization with. These are all things that really are meant to be captured. And that's really what the chapter is trying to get at. So you could understand how you break it down. So you're looking at things like, and it's always easier to start with the products and service that your organization is offering. And from there, you can branch out and understand all the risks that you have. And from that, you can then determine from an enterprise level, and they want you to go minute, go down the line. So, it may be as simple as there may be a callback requirement for certain things. And have you, one, documented that in procedure? What is it being tested to make sure that you're carrying it out? That's part of your controls, is it not? And they want to make sure that you've documented and you have your plan looks at all of these things, and you have determined what the overall risk of all of those factors are to the organization. And with that, then you look at, once you've completed that, you create an overall risk of that enterprise assessment that you've done. So not only will every risk that you've looked at have an assessed rating, but you will give yourself an overall risk rating of that enterprise plan or assessment that you've done to determine whether you consider yourself, based on all of these risks, to be either low, moderate, or high. All right? That was a mouthful, right? All right. So in the chapters, they try to help you go through some of these things. Obviously, some of those risks will relate to other things. So for example, in customer due diligence, you're looking at a geographical risk, right? You want to know what jurisdiction is your customer coming from, and we'll go on to why that becomes important. But you're looking at the geographical risk of the customer to you, right? Likewise, from an enterprise risk assessment, you're going to, to give you like a little twist on that, you're looking at it from where are you delivering this product in terms of jurisdictions to where you're offering it, or persons to the customers that you're offering your product, where are they located? And how does that affect the risk, the geographical risk to your organization, to the fact that you're offering this product or service, for example, to somebody in Israel, for example. All right, what's the risk? It could even be the US. What's the risk? The risk to your organization might mean the fact that you're now, because you're offering that product to an American citizen, and depending on how you're trying to offer that to the client may depend on whether, there again, you have some kind of US regulatory oversight that comes into play. All right? And so these are the risks that you're looking at from an enterprise risk. So then when you're looking at a money laundering terrorist financing risk, technically you're looking at them slightly in, I wouldn't say in the reverse, but here's what you're going to do. So so enterprise risk, you were looking at your operational risk. Your money laundering risk, your money laundering terrorist financing proliferation risk, you're looking at the operational risk of your organization, how those factors affect the operational risk of your organization. All right? So because of the fact that you're offering a certain product may affect your operations in terms of, one, from a money laundering terrorist financing proliferation, said that all in one breath. When you're looking at it from that perspective, how, in terms of the way you're offering that product from an operational standpoint, so are you able to determine, can you transaction monitor? Can you look at each transaction? If there are wires connected with that service or product, you know, what can you monitor in that process? Can you say that, can you really determine from the your software how many wires you're sending to what jurisdictions? Because then you got cross-border issues, and that becomes an operational risk to your organization. Yes, Sam.
Quick question. In terms of when you speak to operational risk, is that equivalent to when you talk about the enterprise risk assessment that falls under that heading? When you gave us, remember you gave us five risk assessments. Would that operational risk fall under enterprise?
So some of the risks that you're looking at to your organization is going to fall within all five of those things. So let's look at operational risk will fall into enterprise. Operational risk of to your organization, or your ability from an operational standpoint to pick up the risk, will fall into the money laundering terrorist financing risk assessment. It also falls into how you risk raise your client. Okay? And so one of the great things about being a compliance officer is the fact that you have to learn what it is that your organization does from top to bottom, because you have to be able to assess the risk. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to do it all by yourself. No, because enterprise risk really requires your board to be part of that process. An enterprise risk is really your board, your organization, and your board, because here's how we tie things in. Your board is responsible for the overall corporate governance of your organization, right? We know from our current legislation that, you know, you can't say you did not know. And one of the things that risk assessment, an enterprise risk assessment does, for example, and I'm just pulling that one out, it helps the directors look at, from a corporate governance, where do we have the gaps? Where are we prepared to take the risk? What do we need to look at in our forward planning of the organization? And that might mean putting financial resources towards buying IT software and systems, for example. It may mean training for our staff. Where do we then put reallocate our finances in order to reduce some of our risk? Okay, so you see how it all comes together? So it's important to be able to tie it all together, because otherwise you don't understand why you're doing all these risks. So And if I sound like a sports record, I probably am. But it's important to understand. So for corporate governance, your board is required to understand what is happening in the organization. And one of the best ways for them to do it is through an enterprise risk assessment. Because in that, you have to look at all your risks. And why I say that is you need to put together a team, for example, because you're not going to be able from a compliance, because the enterprise risk isn't really meant to be a compliance assessment, so to speak. Although compliance forms a part of the enterprise risk, it isn't meant to be done on that level. It's really meant to have all the stakeholders at the table looking at the risk and who can best tell you where the risks are within the organization that you may not a compliance officer wouldn't have been able to pick up, or the board by themselves may not have picked up. But because you have the persons at the table from all of those areas, you would then be able to better determine the risk because you have everybody there. And what does that mean? It means that even though I may be in operations, I may necessarily not see some of the risks that operations affect and how it affects the operations of the business. So for example, operations may not necessarily think to say, okay, well, right, well, did we really look at how our ability to provide our client with clear and concise financial statements, how that affects our liability risk of the bank or the financial institution. Because as a fiduciary, sorry guys, I forgot to mute my phone. Tatiana, answer the phone. As a financial institution, you may have a fiduciary risk to produce financials so that you can show how you're managing the client's assets. And if you can't produce that, that becomes an operational amongst other risks for your organization. Okay. And so an enterprise risk, like a national risk assessment, requires all the right persons at the table. So that's a very good question it came up, because it's difficult for one person to do these kind of assessments. And so it requires everybody to be on board to understand that why risk assessments are important. And this all goes to culture, does it not? It goes into what is the culture of your organization. There again, we're tying something else in that affects not your risk assessment. Hold this moment for me, ladies and gentlemen. Guys, I'm sorry about that. My mom, unfortunately, is under nursing care, and I just had an emergency that I had to deal with, so I apologize for that. Right, so back to risk assessment. All right, so basically what I've said so what I'm saying is that on an enterprise risk assessment, you're going to have, just like with a national risk assessment, you're going to have all the stakeholders you should have all the stakeholders at the table to help to identify all the risks. One person isn't going to be able to identify all the risks. That's the reality of the situation. And so it really is a team effort. The board needs to sign off on not only your enterprise risk assessment, because you have to demonstrate to the regulator, here again, this is where corporate governance comes in, that they have been a part of this. They understand why your organization has risk rated all these factors with the rating they have, that you understand the control gaps. And wait, here's the other point, and this comes out of all risk assessment. You have an action plan in place to close the gap. You've identified the risk, you know what controls that you have in place, you know where the shortfalls are, and you've decided how you're going to address that. And the board has to be on board with that, because they cannot say they did not know. We know that risk assessments all came about through cases like Enron and BNP Paribas doing whatever they wanted and getting $19 billion of fines. Okay? Most of us can't even contemplate $19 billion of fines. Shoot, $10 in fines seems expensive for me. But can you imagine $19 billion in fines? You will also, we have so many examples of why risk assessments need to be put in place. And unfortunately, throughout the years, from cases like HSBC buying out Mexican and Brazilian interests and not being sure that the policies and procedures, that KYC policies and procedures that they have in place in the rest of their organization is filtered through those new arms that they purchased, which then left them open for money laundering risks, where you had criminals being able to launder money through their organization and they didn't even pick it up. You know what I mean? So all of this is to help us as well to avoid things like regulatory fines and penalties, because we fail to be able to pick up where we have the gaps. And that's why we're moving to a risk-based approach for everything. Okay? So in the chapters, I won't go into all of them. There's a ton of them. Let me pick out this specific page. At one, Tatiana, can you turn the light on for me, please? Thank you, darling. Okay. So, right, under section 7 of unit 9, they go into detail to explain a lot of the risk factors that you would cover. So I think I said 9, but they have 10. So there they talk about what are the risk factors to your organization, and they attempt to give you examples of each one of them. So there they went through criminal risk of money laundering, regulatory risk, which we kind of touched on already. They look at your legal risk, reputational risk. We all know the danger of reputational risk, and you have to look at everything through your organization. When you look at your delivery channels, if you have some kind of third party assisting you in offering your products, if you don't understand who that third party is and how they do their business and what controls and they have in place, that could affect your overall reputational risk. And we all know that when your reputation is lost, it's very hard to gain, right? It could be lost in a second. Enron was never able to come back, was it? Arthur Andersen was the accounting firm connected with it. What happened to Arthur Andersen? Do people even know about Arthur Andersen anymore? You see what I'm saying? The reputation that you built over years can be lost in a second because you didn't assess the risk properly, or because you have one rogue in place. They're doing their own thing and nobody thought to rein them in. All right? And so I didn't go into all the granular details they look at when you look at risk assessment. I did touch on some of them. Obviously, some of these you'll see where they cross the line, they go across the board. And that's why I talked about geographical risk, because we know that certain countries, unfortunately, because of the way they operate, determines and will affect how we operate. Why? Because we already know that the international community is going to look at them in a particular way. They may have sanctions on top of them. They may have SDN, which is specially designated nationals, individuals who they've said are on stop lists. So you guys have gone through sanctions, and you looked at things like OFAC. So we know who OFAC is. OFAC is the American kind of equivalent to what? The EU blacklisting. Okay, so OFAC is the arm in the US that will determine who gets put on a special designated nationals list, which countries then become concerned. So anytime you're dealing with these kind of persons, if you even sending a wire, much less talking to them on the phone, you may have an issue. And we know one of the things that's coming out of all of these things too is the fact that if you're not risk assessing and you don't understand the risk to your organization, and you may have other issues. So one of the liabilities that your organization and regulatory issues that you may find is that some legislations are very far-reaching. They're extraterritorial in how they apply or affect your organization. So it's easy for us to say that we're not operating in the US, we're in the Bahamas. That's great, but guess what? US law says if you are assisting companies to do certain types of things, like you're helping or you're assisting an American company, for example, to operate in China, and in order for them to get the big contracts, the money's passed through your organization to pay off the political officials so they can get the contracts that they need. Your organization is deemed to be just as culpable. You're going to get fined. You may find that your correspondent bank automatically drops you, because why? Most correspondent banks are operating out of where? The US. And they're not going to take the risk because they know that the Department of Justice in the US, because of these extraterritorial legislations, it don't care who was part of it, so long as you will help it. If you try now to go to the US, or you're trying now to operate from the US, they're like, oh, thank you, come on this way. We have no problem in bringing legal action, criminal proceedings against you. All right, and we've seen that happen. Look at how, and I'm not digressing because it all comes into context. Look at how Credit Suisse and a lot of the Swiss banks. Let's just, all of the Swiss banks. I don't want to single out Credit Suisse because I used to work for them, but anyway, let's not single them out. All of the Swiss banks got done in for why? Why? Because they were helping U.S. nationals avoid paying their taxes. And the Department of Justice, because their tax legislation is extraterritorial, says anybody who assists them in avoiding their taxes is just as liable under U.S. law. So you see where the CEO of a big Swiss bank, who I won't mention again, ends up traveling to the U.S. And what happens? Department of Justice is waiting for him as he gets off the plane. Or they bring criminal proceedings against him in the U.S. so that he can't travel to the U.S. and he's too scared of traveling because why? What happens if something technically goes wrong with his plane and he has to land in the U.S.? The U.S. Department of Justice said, thank you very much. I'm glad you were able to come. All right? And so all of that becomes part of your risk that you got to assess. Why do I say that? Because when you're looking at your money launderers, terrorist financing risk, we're looking at corruption. How am I helping to facilitate politicians or unsavory individuals who are maybe facilitating bad practices, like anything from insider trading to helping your client get lucrative contracts, helping somebody like Mr. Abachi, who you all will read about in your chapter if you didn't know about him before. But he was the Ugandan president who was quite happy to filter away all of the monies from the public treasury into his own accounts. Right? So Abachi is part of the reason why we're now into risk assessment. Why? Because he used every possible means that he could. He hired the best lawyers, the best private bankers and investment advisors to figure out how he could hide the money. All right? And so were we affected in the Bahamas? Yeah, we had some trusts in other accounts here and companies that had some Abachi money too. But all of this was said that if we, in those days, were properly risk assessing our operations, our customers, we would have been able to pick up way before it hit the roof that we had a Mr. Abachi in our midst. All right? And then what makes it even worse now is that when you come to customer due diligence, if you didn't pick that up, and we now have assets that fall within that category of assets that can be pulled back to go back to Nigeria because he technically stole from his country. That makes us now responsible for making sure it doesn't go anywhere else. We become the gatekeeper to ensuring that the money can get back to Nigeria, because a lot of places have now implemented legislation that will say, okay, if you, Mr. ABC, was the corrupt political leader or politician from wherever, Jabim, and you then used a financial institution in the Bahamas to move those funds that you kind of just thought that they look better in your purse than the country's purse, then the Bahamas is then required to hold on to that money so that it can be repatriated back to the country that it was taken from. That's another liability that you didn't think about. And with that liability becomes all kind of other things, because then the regulator can say, how come you didn't pick it up? There's your regulatory risk you didn't consider, which may mean you get fines and penalties because then your procedures and whatever have you weren't up to scratch, right? Then you got legal action Now you're involved and your name all over the press because you see on the BBC how the Bahamas, a bank in the Bahamas or whatever financial institution in the Bahamas was part of the big consortium of countries that helped to hide the money. Reputation. Client's going to say, okay, well, and how do I know, our money don't get mixed up or whatever have you in that? And can I be assured that you're doing everything that you can to keep everything safe? All right. So with your money laundering risk assessment, you're looking at things like, have we looked at how all of these things affect our regulatory, there again, regulatory risk? All of these things come into effect, legal risk, financial risk. And so that's why it's important to see how all of these things come together. The same countries that your correspondent bank are going to list as high, you're going to list as high. Client sending money to Afghanistan should cause you some concern, right? And your correspondent bank, seeing that you're sending monies or assisting to send money to Afghanistan, may say, okay, hold on. I don't know if we need to be doing business with you anymore. Okay? So that is, in a nutshell, that chapter. And how does that all affect your question? So in your question, one of the things that they ask you is at the beginning, and we'll go through this again a little later, but one of the questions, and I written all my notes here, they ask you to conduct an investigation and to discover really what are the risks to the organization. One of the things you're going to start out with doing is doing risk assessment, right? Because how else are you going to determine what are the risks to your organization? Now, the question is, from an enterprise risk assessment, some of the factors that they outline in your, how should some of those factors have been picked up? And then from a money laundering risk assessment perspective, there again, how should it have been picked up? I'm going to go into a little bit more some of those things later. But you see how that's already helped you to answer the first part of your question. How are you going to determine the risk? You got to do a risk assessment. You need to know what are the risks to your organizations before you can determine how to fix it, right? See how it all comes into perspective? Understand the risk. To be able to understand the risk, you have to know how to figure out what the risks are. So that's clue one to your question. Right. So like everything else, and this is where all risk assessments are continuous. They're not required that you do it once and never do it ever again. The risks to your organization are changing daily. We know that criminals are always one step ahead, and they're always thinking about new ways and new means of achieving what they need to do. And so your organization has to keep up and reevaluate on a regular basis. Now, what becomes regular may be prescribed by legislation. It may be prescribed by your regulator. I started to say, and I don't think I finished off the fact, is that in different countries, risk assessments are done at different times. And not everybody is equal. And I say that because, like I said, not all regulators in every country require you to do an enterprise and a money laundering risk assessment. The central bank in the Bahamas requires all its licensees on an annual basis to do a risk assessment. And you have to then submit that risk assessment to your regulator. Now, TCI, for example, requires a risk assessment, but there is no specific guidance or requirement by the regulator that it be done annually. Cayman, FEMA, the way they write it out, presupposes that you're going to do a risk assessment and you're doing it on a regular basis, an annual basis. However, do all regulators require you to submit by a particular period of time? Some even say you don't have to do a risk assessment until every 3 years. That's their cycle for you doing it. Most countries are coming now on board where the regulator is requiring you to do the risk assessments on an annual basis, or note the or as you introduce new products and services. All right, so that you're aware of the risk to your organization. The DR, for example, which is the Dominican Republic, they are similar to the Bahamas in that they require an annual submission of an enterprise risk as well as a money laundering terrorist risk assessment. So it varies from country to country. The important thing is understanding what's important for your jurisdiction, correct? Because failure to submit will lead to regulatory fines and penalties on your organization. And obviously how the regulator views how they risk rated you in the beginning, correct? Because if you're not handing things in when you're supposed to, then they think then that becomes a control gap within your organization, is it not? Because somehow those areas that are responsible for submitting reports, whether they be monthly, quarterly, annually, to your regulator, if you're not doing it in time, the reason why penalties are put in place is to force you to do it, for one, and nothing hurts worse than if you're feeling it through your pocket, right? Because if you're feeling it through your pocket, then those bonuses and all kind of other incentives that you have for your employees are then reduced, are they not? And then you get disgruntled employees. Everything has a knock-on effect, right? So one of the things that you may consider in your money laundering assessment, I apologize for my daughter. I didn't know the camera was on, I'm sorry. So she didn't know the camera was on. One of the things that you look at is how are certain things in your organization, and this is where you're going to have to note for your assessment, how are certain things in your organization going to affect your overall risk? So for example, codes of conduct being in place are put there so that we all are on the same page from top to bottom as to what is expected of employees of the organization and how we operate and how we hold ourselves accountable so that we can reduce these same risks, correct? Likewise, when you have persons who are being assessed based on the commission or the number of clients that they're bringing into an organization, that will affect how they consider the risk. So for example, if I know that I am going to get a $2 million bonus if I bring on ABC clients, right? I may not necessarily consider all of the money laundering, terrorist financing risks that client plays to my organization. Really, which is what your question is getting at, isn't it? So then you may have to look at, when you're doing your enterprise risk assessment, from an HR perspective, is how are you evaluating and assessing your client, your staff, and how does that affect how they conduct themselves and therefore affect the risk to your organization? Because somebody who perhaps maybe is getting, whose risk assessed, their evaluation at the end of the year in terms of how they're doing and whether or not they get a bonus at the end of the year. If that is based on commissions and the number of clients or the size of the asset that they're bringing in, they may not necessarily consider all the risks to your organization when they're trying to onboard. And they may not necessarily be as transparent as they need to be to the compliance officer, for example, when they're explaining or providing information that affects the background and the risk of this client or your organization. Okay? Yes,
Excuse
ma'am?
me, Mrs. Fico Moxey, I have a question. How does HR inculcate that specific item that you just spoke about into their, I don't know, an employee's performance appraisal in order to mitigate that risk? Because that's a very important item. How does HR do that? And I guess with me looking at it from a regulator standpoint, there are certain things that are considered confidential from an HR perspective. So how are you able to, how is let's say I'm the compliance officer, how is HR able to inculcate that into their, into the performance appraisal for them?
Good. That's a very good question. And so one of the things and why you see that, you know, everything is tied together nowadays. And so when the board is looking at how you are risk assessing or you're doing performance evaluations, how much weight are you putting on the fact that it's based on a commission or it's based on the number of assets, the value of the asset that the sales officer is bringing in or the client relationship officer. That cannot be the sole factor of which, and cannot outweigh the other factors that are taken into consideration when evaluating a staff member. So you have to look at other things, right? So that might be part of it, but then there may be other parts of it. You may have to tie that into money laundering. So for example, or, you know, in terms of how effective were they or how quick were they in one, communicating to the client what was needed and obtaining the information so that compliance and risk didn't have to keep going back and asking for the same thing, or for all the information that you needed to properly risk assess that client. So those are some of the things that you have to balance it out. It can't be one-sided, because then you create that that risk that look at Enron, for example. Enron, they base your performance on how you were able to increase the client's portfolio. That was the sole factor in determining whether or not whatever somebody got at the end of the year in terms of how well they did from a staff performance perspective, and what kind of bonus that they got. Of course, everybody wanted to work for them because, you know, hey, if I was walking away with a $2 million bonus or more, I'd love to go to them. And yes, I'm going to cut corners because at the end of the day, that all of those things are going to affect my bottom line. And so HR with the board and the business and all the key stakeholders, and that would include compliance, have to really determine a program that manages those risks, that balances those out. Okay? So that's one of the factors that they have in your question. And they touch on it when they spoke about how the business is, how it would inhibit sales, and it looked at performance. So there again, that becomes part of your factor that you have to take into consideration when you're looking at the risk, the controls, what may be needed in terms of your recommendation, right? Okay. Now, all of these things that I'm talking about, they're all in the book. So I'm not bringing anything new that's outside of the book. The information is there. You just have to be able to lift it out and use it effectively. Okay? And being able to do that is understanding what all the material means. And that's why I'm trying to bring it in scope. Okay? So if I'm deviating, you don't understand, or just ask, I'm happy to explain, stop and explain. Okay? So, like everything, risk assessment requires continual risk assessment. So with clients, here's where you go into customer due diligence. You're not going to risk rate your client once and never go back and look at them again, are you? Even in your life, things change, correct? We live in a constant state of flux. What we did 10 years ago, we're not probably doing 10 years later. The same factors that affected us 10 years ago are not the factors that are affecting us now. As we age, as things in our life changes, so then would our conduct change, for example. And likewise with clients, all right? So a client, you take on a client. So now I'm jumping over into customer risk assessment, right? Why is it important to risk rate your customer? Here again, it's important to risk rate your customer so that you can assess the risk that that customer poses to your organization, right? And in assessing that, you're going to look at almost the same things, aren't you? You're going to look at the product that's being offered. How risky is the product? How is it, or maybe even the take on or the investment in that product, how is that going to attract perhaps maybe a certain element of customer, for example? When we look at customers, we look at things like geographical risk. There again, it comes up again, right? If your client is in Iraq, you know you're going to have issues transferring money to your client, right? That's the reality. But does it necessarily mean that your client is high risk? That's the question you have to find out. Because your client may have been, your client may not necessarily be from Iraq, may not be born, bred there. Their source of income, source of wealth is not derived from there. They just happen to live there. I'll give you an example of a real case that I had. So I had a client that was living in Israel. He actually conducts his business from Israel. He's an investment advisor. So in their jurisdiction, or their region of the world, it isn't strange to use a bank in Lebanon. Everywhere else in the world, it's kind of like a red flag, is it not? But it's understanding what it is that the client is doing. So in part of our risk rating of our client, it's going to be almost not exactly the same, but almost similar. We're going to look at various factors that's going to influence the rating that we give to the customer, correct? We're going to look at things like the type of business the customer is in, the geographical area in which the client's business is operating, or where the client himself or herself is situated. We're going to look at what type of products that they're asking for. We're going to look at things like what type of business is the client in? Is the client a cash-intensive business? We know already that those cash-intensive businesses are quite easy to be used for money laundering purposes, correct? Because it's easy to cook the books and say that the business is doing a lot better than it is when it's already a cash-intensive businesses. Give me some cash-intensive businesses, people. Don't be shy.
Convenience store.
Gas stations.
Yes. Bigger cash-intensive businesses would be like your casinos, for example.
Restaurants, liquor stores.
Yes, restaurants, liquor stores. These are cash-intensive. And it's, pardon? I didn't hear you.
Beauty salons.
Yes, beauty salons. It's hard to keep track of how many people are going in and out of those places, isn't it? And it's easy to say that the actual revenue is is higher than it actually is. It's easy to do that. With a good accountant could do that quite easily. Mind you, if you go and visit the place, you may realize if you just stood outside for a minute that there isn't that much traffic going into that business or that establishment to be able to have the kind of turnovers that they're depositing into your institution. So what does that mean for your institution? It means what kind of controls are you putting in place? So it may mean that your institution might go and have a look at where the business is actually located. Go there. Stand outside for a minute. Do they really have that much traffic? For example, in terms of persons coming in and out of the store to do business. Right? We're going to look at things like source of wealth, source of funds when we evaluate our client. Correct? So this is an easy question. What's the difference between source of wealth and source of funds? I love to ask this question. Don't everybody jump at it. Somebody tell me what source of wealth is first.
That's how you acquire your funds, a source of wealth, or your whole entire I guess money in your account. But a source of funds will be an individual transaction.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. So let's look at it like this. So how I acquired my assets is my source of wealth. Now, what does that mean? Am I going to accept something like somebody telling me that it's inheritance? So, yeah, I could have been a bar chief's grandchild and I inherited the money from him. Am I going to be concerned? Of course I am. So the fact that somebody tells me it's inheritance is not going to be sufficient, for example. I sold my business. Great. What type of business were you in? What was the name of your business? In today's world, you can Google anything. Now, there are certain limitations. For example, I was at one place and the client had died and the estate was coming to the financial institution where I worked. And they were like, oh, so he was the guy who invented birth control. I said, oh, yeah? So what was his name? Right? Now, you go out there and you don't find nothing on Joe Blog who invented birth control. That is something that's pretty well known. That's going to be one of those trivia question facts. And you can't substantiate that, there is going to be a problem. Right? So your source of wealth is going to be, so that's your source of wealth. So your source of funds, for example, is going to be the deposits coming into your account on a regular basis. So for example, on a retail account, the average person's source of funds is going to be their what? It comes in monthly.
Salary.
Yes,
Salary.
their salary, right? So you would ask questions like, so where are you employed? In today's world, I mean, some people still pay by check, but most people are transferring it comes by wire transfer from the employer to the employee. So if you have a letter of employment and you are able to, over the period of time that you can track and see the money's coming in, you can substantiate and verify where the funds are coming from, can you not? Now, obviously, if they tell me that they are a clerk and they're getting a six-figure salary from the company that's coming in monthly, I want to know what's going on at that company, correct? Because I don't know too many clerks that are being paid six figures. So we look at things in terms of reasonableness, don't we? Pardon? They may do generously, but I'd like to know who they are. Let's just err on the side of skepticism and say that something is not right there. But obviously, we take a reasonableness approach to these things, okay? So we would look at things in terms of our customer rating. We may decide, for example, not everybody has to be a high-risk customer, correct? We can risk rate low, medium, and high, and depending on the level of the client will determine how we and what type of information do we need from the client. So, Mr. Security man coming in to open his security officer coming in to open the account will more than likely not be risk rated high, correct? So we wouldn't require as much of that client as we would to Bill Gates coming in to open up an account with us. Correct? We're going to ask a bit more. I mean, whilst there's a lot of information out there on the internet about Bill Gates, we need to be sure we are really dealing with Bill Gates, aren't we? Or not Bill Gates' impersonator. You know what I mean? We want to know that we're dealing with the real Bill Gates. And we know that with Bill Gates, we're dealing with a lot more volume and size of transfers as compared to the security officer that's doing business with us, correct? So what we would ask of the security officer in terms of KYC and understanding our customer is not going to be the same as what we ask for Bill Gates, correct? Now, does that mean that we apply so the same? No, we're going to require enhanced due diligence and maybe for our high risk and a simplified due diligence for our low risk. And the central bank in its current guidelines kind of provides that, does it not? Because we know that in the past that the commercial institutions were having a difficult time risk rating everybody at the same rating. And one of the things that we found over time is that risk rating everybody the same way will lead to other issues. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to keep the rating. That means we could change the rating if we have to. So if we understand the nature of our security officer, we know how much he's getting paid on an average basis. We could see that for the money's coming in. If we all of a sudden see that he's now getting a lot more in terms of he's making a six-figure, would that not put us on notice to maybe ask some more questions and understand what's going on? Are we being used for something else? And so therefore, our risk rating of that client may change, and it may also mean that we may have to say goodbye to Mr. Security Officer because he can't justify the increase in his monthly salary that's now coming in. Right? Or perhaps maybe what he's using the account for. So if a client opens up a deposit account and then all of a sudden we see money's coming in from all over the place, you have to reassess that account to say, is he now using this for his business? And then if it's business versus personal, then perhaps maybe he needs to open a business account so we could better monitor that, so that we don't have personal funds and business funds being mixed and we can't tell the difference. Nor can we truly track and understand where money is coming and going. All right. One of the things we ask clients for, and the central bank requires, for example, and not just the central bank, the Securities Commission as well, we want to understand the type of transactions that's going to go through a client's account, don't we? We want to know volume. We want to know what can we expect on a monthly basis, for example. Right? All of that will determine how we risk rate. Whether we risk rate that client high, a client who's doing a cash intensive business. I would find it strange for an organization to risk rate a cash-intensive business as low. Now, why is that? We already said part of the reason. They can be easily used for criminals and criminal activity to filter the funds of their criminal activity through that organization. And a good accountant can help them do it easy. Right? So here's where compliance officers have to be part accountant as well. You have to be able to look and see what is looking different here. Why, on a monthly basis, because remember now, one of the things we're supposed to be doing is transaction monitoring. That also plays a part on whether we re-risk rate our client, right? Because all those things we just talked about. If we have a level of activity that we're expecting and we're exceeding that level of activity, then that puts us on notice we have to reassess and ask some more questions. We may have to get some more information. And remember, KYC is an ongoing basis. Understanding, knowing your client is ongoing. You have to develop that relationship with your client. Okay? It isn't in the days gone by. Okay, so yeah, I have a laundry. And I write that down and I never try to find out anything else about the client ever again. And so I missed that, his earnings, but he hasn't expanded his business, increased from 100,000 a year to 5 million. How is that possible? You haven't increased your business. You haven't increased the size of your business, but you sure are making a lot more money. Now the smart criminals out there, they'll open up some dummy storefronts elsewhere. You know what I mean? But it's still understanding, getting financials. Gone are the days where we say we don't know our customer. The great thing with VAT returns is that we can get an understanding by getting a copy of their VAT return, how that business is operating, correct? I see some accountants out there, and I'm sure you guys can help me out with that. Listen, I had to pass 101 accounts to get to law school. I am no accountant, but you can't fool me. Put it like that. All right. And through the years, with working through financial institutions, I become even more adept at reading financial statements. So there again, compliance officers are jacks of all trades. So that being said, in risk rating your customer, you're going to look at all of these factors, are you not?
Question, would you consider a law firm cash intensive business as well?
So let's get back to the history of why law firms and accountant firms and real estate agents are considered what? What's that nice acronym that we use for them? Non-financial business professions and businesses. Did I get that right? Yes. Mm-hmm. So yes, the reason why they are captured is because what's one of the easiest ways for me, being the customer who wants to put some of my proceeds from my criminal activities into the financial system? I'm not trying to put it through my account. I want to put it through your account. How am I putting it through your account? I'm going to put it through your client account, right? So in a law firm, how am I going to put that through your client account? I'm going to, like even real estate agent, I'm going to buy some real property, for example, or I'm going to buy a business and I'm going to transfer the funds through you. Dear Mr. Attorney or Mr. Attorney, dear Mr. or Mr. Accountant. All right. So this is one of the reasons why, you found that these type of professions fell under the scrutiny of the international community, and why they now fell, just like other financial institutions, to having some kind of regulatory oversight, correct? So who is the regulator for accountants, realtors, and lawyers in the Bahamas? Now, that's a trick
Compliance
question,
Commission.
but it is the Compliance Commission. But here's the trick question. Depending on whether you're a financial and corporate service provider, will determine also whether you fall under the Securities Commission, correct?
That's correct. And as a financial and corporate service provider, if you have that type of license, then you fall under the remit of the Securities Commission.
Yes. And so the requirements that you would have probably been asked of by the Compliance Commission may not necessarily be the same anymore. You're required to do a lot more. Now, one of the things that we got done in by CFAT F4 was the fact that all our regulators are not equal. And I say that gingerly because, why do I say that? Because what the Insurance Commission may have asked of a life insurance company is not the same that the Securities Commission would ask of a financial corporate service provider, is not the same as the central bank would require of a bank and trust. Now, CFATF and the rest of the international community would say everybody needs to be on the same playing field. Everybody has to have the same things in place. And so when we amended our legislation in 2018, you see how that everybody was brought into a tighter regime where everybody is practically doing the same thing, correct? So the 2018 amendments to the legislation, the Financial Transaction Reporting Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, and go through the whole list of them. Terrorist Financing Act was to ensure that everybody is doing practically the same thing, right? So risk assessments now are actually mandated in legislation in the Bahamas. Did you know that? Have a quick look through the Financial Transaction Reporting Act. Everybody has to do a risk assessment. Most people overlook that fact. Now, does the Compliance Commission really require law firms and accounting firms to submit a risk assessment? Do they really follow up on it? Okay, I leave that to you all. But it is a requirement. Okay? And I'm trying to remember, I used to know it out of my head, the actual section. It could have, I think it's is it 19?
Under the FDRE 2018, it's Section 5, Conduct of a Risk Assessment.
Yes, thank you. So, interesting enough, the Bahamas is not the only jurisdiction in which it's now incorporated into legislation. Now, the necessary regulatory body who has oversight for that industry determines then how well they're policing it. But you'll find that everybody eventually comes back onto the same page, because then you find that international pressure is put on us and bam, everybody comes back on the same page. Bam. So that being said, that's how we can make sure everybody's doing everything that, so what a law firm is required to do is no different now than what SFI is required to do. Why? Because everybody has to now be on the same page. We're trying to get off blacklists. And in order to do that, we can't take the view any longer that, oh, well, lawyers and accountants should be they should be exempted. Why? They're not any different. They can be used, if not even a lot more easily than a financial institution. Financial institutions are more aware of the risks, I think, and therefore are ahead of those industries where it just was felt that they couldn't be used in that way, but life has found that they are used in that way. All right. It's easy for me to put something through. I mean, gone are the days when law firms were used by drug dealers in the Bahamas, for example. I'm just using that term because, you know, we have a history. So let's not kid ourselves. Law firms in terms of their clients' accounts were used to move money for criminal in terms of criminal activity. That's the realistic part of it. How? Of course, it was used to create structures, and the money was passed through the attorney's or the accountant's client account and move into the structure set up for the customer, right? So now you're required to know your customer. And not only that, they will come in and see what your files are. What kind of due diligence do you have on your customer? Do you know who you're dealing with? Do you know the client's business? Do you truly understand the business? What do you have on your file to show that? Right? So the world has changed in that regard. The playing field is becoming a lot more even. And so everybody, I mean, you find we went from persons dealing in precious stones and metals. They have similar requirements. It's easier, one of the easiest ways for me to move funds is to buy precious jewels and stones. I can transport them easily and sell them when I get to my destination. The fact that I bought them or I put the monies into the financial system, I have a product that I could use and I'm going to be able to sell it. And now you find that the regulations in that industry that's dealing with precious metals and stones has tightened up, right? So a client who's doing a lot of purchases through a credit card, a preloaded credit card, for example, might cause me a bit of concern because, you know, I can go, you know, you find that places like the Targets and the Walmart that have those cards that you could preload. There are a lot of places now, legislation limits in terms of how much money they can preload those cards with, correct? So there again, risk rating depends on the product that you're offering. Gone are the days where they'd offer you a credit card and it doesn't have a name at the bottom. Yes, that used to happen. When I came into the financial services industry, you could get a credit card with no name on it. In today's world, you'll be like, what? I don't think so. But there again, that's then a high-risk product, is it not? And that should affect how I risk rate my customer. Likewise, you know, it determines then how often am I reviewing my customer. My high-risk customer, I may review every 6 months to a year, for example. My low-risk customer, I may review that customer's file and transactions more closely every 3 years. Because they're plain vanilla. I'm getting the same salary every month. They pay the same bills. Nothing is changing. Now, obviously, I should be able to pick up when there is a change that's out of the ordinary. But unless there's something that causes me to have a red flag, I can determine that I don't need to look at that client or review that client's file and see whether that client the risk rating should change for that client more than every 3 years. So in the financial services industry, prior to everybody else having to risk rate their clients, because now everybody has to risk rate their clients, even your lawyers and your accountants, for example. All right. In the financial services industry, we were risk rating our clients a long time in terms of how often were we reviewing the client. That's not new. So when you're risk rating your client, these are some of the factors that you're looking at. And so this is where in chapter 10, They're looking at things like how transparent is the operation that I'm dealing with. Determining whether or not my client is high risk or not. If I have a complex structure where I'm dealing with a company in the middle of a structure that must be got about 100 million companies up above, right? The law now says, what do I have to do? I have to get to the beneficial owner. And the beneficial owner is not another company. It has to be an individual. All right, so that means I got to drill through all of those 100 companies to get to where I need to be. That's where I have to be. So the days of when ABC company comes in and I don't know who the shareholders are, and if the shareholder is another company and I don't understand who's behind that other company who's the shareholder, those days are gone. There's a requirement on me because the risk to my organization is too great. I have to know, even from just a tax perspective in the Bahamas, we have CRS and FATCA. From our tax reporting obligations, we have to know who the individuals are, the ultimate owners are. We have to know who the mind and management of that company is. Who is controlling that company? No longer can you say, oh man, they just part of this big company over here. Yeah, sure. If the company is a publicly listed company in some stock exchange somewhere, well, reputable, so I mean, if it's a U.S. stock exchange, we know that they're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops, correct? And that they're going to have certain things in place, and the SEC, when they go in, going to know who is behind that company. Now, what we may require, and there again, that determines how we risk rate again. Part of our risk rating in a complex structure is going to be more than likely high, right? Because I got to go and do enhanced due diligence. I got to drill down and get all kind of information to get to the individual behind it. All right. So where you have a publicly traded company, you may have a situation where you're not going to be required. And even our guidance notes suggest that if it's publicly traded, you don't have to do as much as where all of those companies in there are privately owned. Right? I get this all the time. I have 5 companies, and at the top is a trust. So why do you have to go to the trust? Where did the monies come from initially? One of the things that we learned from Abachi was the fact that he used these complex structures. He would use a trust and about 50 million companies underneath to move the funds down. And then he wasn't beneficiaries of any of his structures. His children were beneficiaries. His wife was beneficiary. And so therefore, from Abachi, that changed our whole definition of who is a pet, right? So one of the things, who are we going to risk as high risk? We're going to have complex structures are going to fall into high risk because we got to drill down and understand the business. We need to know where the money's flowing in and out of that. Who is behind it? If we have a PEP in there, one of the things that Abachi and Marcos and all of these lovely leaders have taught us is we got to figure out if somebody is a PEP or not. And it means that if they are a PEP, everybody knows who a PEP is, a politically exposed person. We're going to put them as high risk. Would you risk rate your PEP as low? No, right? You want to be able to understand the flows in and out. If a client is a, pardon?
Sorry, I have a question with regards to risk rating PEPs. Are you of the view that once a PEP, always a PEP?
I knew I was going to get this. I am of the view that you can take a risk-based approach to PEPs. That's what now I don't believe that I can cross the board, set a date and time to say you cease to be a PEP. Why do I say that? And see, all of this, remember, all of this is falling in. Notice all the things that fell in here. They were dealing with high net worth customers, complex structures. There's a possibility that some of the people that they were dealing with were PEPs. Were they even considering the risk rating in your question?
Right.
You see how I just brought all your answers into play here? The things that you're going to touch on. Now, do I think that once a PEP, always a PEP? I believe that you apply a risk-based. That's my view. And actually, the central bank has taken the view that you can take a risk-based approach. It means, though, that you're going to have to document how you're coming up with your risk-based approach, right? So let me give an example. Some countries will say after a certain period of time. So if I remember correctly, one of the jurisdictions that I will no longer have within the company that I work for, I'm responsible for is the BVI. They have what, after 10 years of being out of politics, you cease to be a PEP. Why don't I agree with that? Because in small countries like we and the Caribbean and other places in the world, the influence of that political person, merely because they cease to be a politician, does not cease. They are still able to influence others to do what they need to have done, correct?
Yeah.
And that's what the risk is to your organization. The fact is, are they still able to influence something in a negative way to better facilitate their pocket? And your institution then becomes part of that. Why? Because you then have all these extraterritorial pieces of legislation. So I may have a PEP that may have been out of politics for 5 years, but because of the type of environment that they live in, they're still very much able to influence how their company gets very lucrative government contracts. All right? And they're still able to, slide a bit, a little package over to whomever. So you have to look at it, and that's why I say I think that you take a risk-based approach. I mean, others differ from me. You might say, no, once a PEP is not always true. I don't necessarily once a PEP is always a PEP. I think you have to risk rate and take a risk-based approach, because I may be a person who may have been in politics, but just because of I retired and I'm happy on what I have, and I'm not really able to, I'm not exercising that influence, then I may be able to risk rate that client, particularly on what I know about that account. For example, I know in terms of me monitoring that account, I know he gets his pension. He may get a government pension, or he may have gotten also on a pension from somewhere else he worked over the years. He has these savings and investments, and nothing really changes. And so, whilst I'm not saying that I wouldn't look at that account at all, I may necessarily reduce the rating after a period of time to moderate, correct? So, a lot of, people would say once a PEP, always a PEP. I do think that in the world that we moved into, you have to look at the factors that will influence or the realm of influence that PEP has. That's my view. A lot of countries now have gone to the risk-based approach. It just means that if you are taking that view, your institution is taking a risk-based approach, you have to fully document your approach. How do you assess whether or not that person should move from high risk to medium risk? Do I think that a PEP will ever be low risk? No. I think their sphere of influence is always there. It's just the degree of that influence may change over the years. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. So, like we said, all of this is going to be part of your overall risk. One of the things I will point out to you One of the things that they asked you here is if you're the MLRO, what are the recommendations or what are the concerns that you would have? In Chapter 9, it actually tells you the risks or concerns that really the MLRO should be considering. So the great thing is they provide all of this stuff for you. You don't have to look far. Don't forget there are cases in here to support your point too. And I want you guys to be able to support your point. I already gave you a case that you could use, the Bachi case that was used for a million things, complex structures, why it's important to understand the business, understand what the client is doing. You should, if your client comes to you and tell you he's in some kind of strange industry and you don't understand that industry, take a step back. Industries we risk rate is high and low, do we not? And that should be part of your risk rating factor. So certain industries are going to cause you to risk rate your, we already talked about it, cash intensive, but not just cash intensive. So if I'm dealing in pharmaceuticals, for example, that may cause me to risk rate my client a little higher and will affect the client's rating. Likewise, a client who may be, like we talked about IT, or I may just be a manufacturer of chemicals, but one chemical by itself isn't going to mean anything. But understanding the use of a number of that one chemical in the greater scheme of things may change my approach to how I risk rate that client. Okay? So, that being said, all of these things that I talked about should come up in your assessment, and how perhaps maybe changes need to be made to your, Tatiana, to the program that this company currently has. All right. The fact that one of the things I thought was interesting, it said, the bullet point that says the files you examine indicate that information about source of wealth and source of funds is often basic and is rarely independently verified. So how are they risk rating their client? Why is it important? Why do those factors become important? We've already discussed some of those. Right? And if you don't know basic stuff about your client, so you know source of wealth, you know source of funds, but you don't know how often are you going, we talked about this, how often and the central bank requires it, number of transactions you expect over the account, volume amount, for example, are two of the key things that is expected by the guidance notes, is it not? If you don't have that, how are you able to monitor? How are you able to know if your client is going awry? And it should play a part in your overall risk rating of a client. A client is doing a lot of transactions, whether they're securities transactions or just cash transactions. A client who's doing international wire transfers. Why are they becoming? Because they're doing cross-border. And therefore, you become part of the global picture. And then all those things that we talked about extraterritorial extent of the legislation, and then being responsible for actually becoming the custodian of assets that now have to go back to a particular country, for example. So we have trust that we're holding Egyptian artifacts, right, that were clearly stolen. As the trustee, you now become the holder of that for who? The Egyptian government. Where you never thought that the Egyptian government was going to become your client. All right? So those are things that become part of your risk assessment. Those are things that you're going to consider and determine what you risk rate. Artwork, easy to buy artwork. All right, one of the famous cases coming out of the most recent trials out of France and the US had to do with a famous family that has art galleries throughout the world, specifically France and US. And two things happened. One, artwork that was stolen through World War II was found to be in their possession, and they couldn't say how it got in their possession. Now, we know that from legislation has been put in place, you have artwork that was stolen, for example, from a Jewish family by the Nazi government at the time. That is going to be returned to the original owners. And guess what? If that in your trust, for example, or company that you're holding, you now have all kind of issues coming at you that you did not foresee because you didn't ask the right questions at the beginning. So the Wildenstein family has art galleries in the US and France. Now, how did some of their stuff come out? Now, I can't remember if they're referenced in there, but there's a good reference for you. For example, some artwork was discovered. And how was it discovered? Because they came under scrutiny because the patriarch of the family, he had gotten married a couple times, and he didn't want one of the particular wives to inherit. So he set up these trusts. And in setting up these trusts, she felt as if she was disenfranchised because under French law, she's entitled to 50% of his estate. And if he went and filtered all the money through trusts and nobody knew about them, and she now was only getting 2 million when she could have gotten 18 million, she was very disgruntled. And so she tried going after the estate, but the gentleman was quite savvy, and he made his children the executors of the estate because really he had at that stage already moved everything that he could into trust. And yes, some of those trusts were in the Bahamas, and one particular trust company here got named and shamed. But in that, how did this come about? Because we all know now that tax offense has become a predicate offense in most jurisdictions. And so what the disgruntled wife did, she made a report to the French government to say that they had lost out on the inheritance tax that they would have gotten on other taxes because he had filtered the money through trust and other companies, so it didn't fall into his estate for which the French government could have taxed. And that becomes a taxable offense. And they went after, went digging into they went and dug into the gentleman's companies. And in so doing, they found this artwork that they couldn't account for that clearly stemmed from stolen artwork that the Germans had filtered away during World War II. So now you have, you had a trust that had some of the artwork, and you had a trust now where you're dealing with some of the assets that fell within the money laundering offense because they fell within a predicate offense, which was tax evasion. So the trust company that had the assets got named and shamed. Now, did they find all of the man's assets? Of course not. But it still came out. I will tell you, though, that Mr. Wildenstein and his sibling were able to successfully in France win their case. So by the time the disgruntled wife case went through the courts, she had died and her estate got nothing. But all of these trust companies, yeah, Wildenstein. So it's called, I think there are companies called Wildenstein and Co., if I remember correctly, or Wildenstein and Wildenstein. I think it's Wildenstein and Co. I think
Did you say that's Wildenstein and Co.?
Wildenstein.
Wilderstein.
W-I-L-D-E-R-S-T-I-E-N, if I remember correctly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Actually, if you Google it now, you will actually see, I think the son Alec is the one that one of the sons come up, Alec, I think. He is the current head of the family. But these are cases that you could use. That's a high net worth individual. And clearly, they needed to do their due diligence. The other thing that I want to raise too here is, one of the questions that they raise is, should the CEO be signing off on all these accounts? There are all kind of risk factors. One, he has a serious conflict of interest because why? He's probably working on some kind of performance-based assessment at the end of every year. Obviously, he wants the company to do well because he's the CEO. If the company does well, he looks good, right? He's probably part of the front line. He's part of the business who really doesn't care at the end of the day, but he should, because as the CEO, he's going to be held just as responsible as everybody else. Correct?
Shasta, I have a question here that I really want to ask. I'll try my best to ask it as transparently as I could. You know, a couple of persons are saying, okay, the MLRO is hired by the company, correct? Who pays the MLRO's salary? Who brings in the money? We understand the independence concept, but this is the issue when you talk about that the conflict of interest that's occurring.
Right.
And so a lot of people are saying, okay, the MLRO has a duty, an ethical duty to act in a certain way, and there should be independence, correct? But at the end of the day, the question is, who pays? How's the MLRO paid? By who?
True.
Who makes that call?
Now, listen, having been in the role of money laundering, the MLRO, the money laundering reporting officer for institutions, I can tell you it's a difficult position to be in. Why is it difficult? Because not all organizations have moved to the theory that there should be a independent reporting of the money laundering reporting officer. And quite often, the money laundering reporting officer is reporting where? Into the CEO. There again, that creates a conflict of interest. And now I will tell you that the regulators don't say, whilst they don't say you have to do it, they will make a strong suggestion. And part of the reason why, and here's where another area that you would have, chapters you would have covered comes into play is, what are the requirements needed for an MLRO? You need somebody who's going to be strong in character, because if you're going to feel intimidated, you can't be in that role. All right? Because if my CEO, it can approve an account by himself, there's already an issue. So there again, one of the things that they speak about in this chapter is, how are these different accounts approved within your organization? Senior management has to be involved the process, and it cannot be one person in senior management signing off to agree. And in most companies, they would have some sort of account opening committee where there are a number of stakeholders at place. There's usually more than one director of the company on that committee, so that you avoid a situation like you have in this case, in your question, where the CEO can control and thereby affect the culture of that organization, affect the risks that that organization is now facing, and thereby affect its overall risk assessment, not only from how a customer is risk rated, but also how the institution itself risk rates itself from an enterprise risk perspective and from a money laundering, terrorist financing perspective. All right. So, you know, it's a difficult, the best thing I could say, Chanel, it's a difficult position. It is always good when you have a company who is on board with ensuring that you have that independence. They have looked at the risk, they understand the risk. And I will tell you, I think penalties and fines have a lot to play in that. Corporate governance has a lot to do with that. The fact that the board of directors has to, on an annual basis, provide certifications to the regulator to ensure that they understand what is going on in the business. And, you know, we've got it backed up in the legislation too. The legislation says, even if you are a manager in the process, if you should have known and you did a willful blindness, you know, see nothing, hear nothing, see nothing, keep my mouth closed, you just as culpable as everybody else, and the law will hold you just as liable, right? That's built into our legislation. Again, I went and did a training to a board of directors, and they were like, what? And there were some senior managers there as well, and they were like, that's built into legislation? I said, yes, it's now built into legislation. All right. And so part of national risk assessment was understanding this difficulty and this tenuous position that money laundering reporting officer is in. It understands why you have to have you have to hold the board accountable. They can't be there and say they don't know what's going on. So therefore, here again, when you talk about risk, what the money laundering, the characteristics, the training, the requirements of your money laundering reporting officer, you usually want your money laundering reporting officer to report to the independent director, correct? The reason why you have an independent director, I'm sure you guys, if you haven't done it yet, in terms of corporate governance, you talk by, you can't have everybody who has an interest in the business being part of the board of directors. You need to create a balance, and having independent directors create that. You see how all this stuff ties together? And when you have the money laundering reporting officer reporting to that person, who in itself, I mean, you know, it's interesting because independent directors they quite often are paid, but still they should still have to create that balance. You know what I mean? That they have to be able to say where the business is going wrong, to bring them back in line. They have to be the moral compass. Compliance officers have to be the moral compass as well, all right, to a limited extent. And so you can have somebody who's afraid of senior management. I mean, it would be great if we have whistleblowing laws in place. I mean, I don't know how well they could protect us in the Bahamas, but we're a small place and everybody know anybody, and they send you to another island. Oh man, I see Sue, man, she was in Freeport. There goes the neighborhood, you know what I mean? But you know, it all brings home why you can't, you have to have that independence of money laundering reporting officer. The fact that the money laundering reporting officer should be able to make a suspicious transaction report to the FIU, and anybody in that organization should be able to make, and our law allows that. to make a suspicious transaction report. That's the reason why that's built in there. Because if I am the money laundering reporting officer and I'm in cahoots with the CEO and everybody else, and you are the clerk that knows what's going on because you see everything, you should be able to ring the bell and raise the awareness that something isn't right, right? And so the law actually goes on to say if you know and you don't, guess what? You could be convicted too. But likewise, it also says that if you do know you are going to report, you can't go and tip off either. So you've been in an interesting position. But you see how it all comes together, right? So you got to have a strong MLRO who has to understand the risks, know what it is that you have to be looking for, but yet being able to stand up and make the determination to report, even if it isn't in the best interest of the company. Now, the legislation does, in a way, protect. It's unfortunate that we are in the kind of society that we are in because guess what? If you get fired in the Bahamas because you were the money laundering officer, let's be real. We live in a small society, right? Somebody could talk and say why, they was just upset with her because she was just standing up or he was standing up for and doing their job. And that they could blacklist you in the Bahamas quite easily, right? But if you have a strong enough regulator, for example, like the inspector says, he'll say, the inspector at the central bank will say, listen, and this is where I think you have more of the regulators becoming, taking that hard line now where you see that they'll say, well, no, I need to have that kind of relationship with the money laundering reporting office, compliance and audit, right? I need to have that, I have to have that relationship with them that they can come to me, and how I deal with that is we meet on a regular basis, whether that's quarterly, twice a year, whether that's annually. We talk about some of the issues that may be facing the organization without repercussion. All right? I mean, nowadays, your money laundering reporting office and inspector say, I need to have your cell phone numbers. I mean, that's the reality. Okay. But all of that comes into risk assessment, is it not? That would be part of the risk. Is the money laundering reporting officer sufficiently independent so that you are mitigating that risk that we just spoke about, all those risks? That's part of your whole assessment, is it not? In this case, I have to wonder, was the money laundering reporting officer sufficiently adequate for that job? They speak about training of the person, lack of knowledge, reporting. All of those things are going to be part of your answer. Now, what's always interesting about this is y'all have 100 marks, and you're going to have to use it wisely, please. Don't just talk about risk assessment, because look at how many things we talked about in there. All right? Risk assessment is part of it. There are a lot of things that we spoke about in how many hours have we been talking? And you guys have to somehow manage to put that in and cover all 10 marks and stay in word count. So look at where they're really, the things that they're asking you. I mean, whilst you could give examples, what they want to be able to get from this, notice what they're asking you to end in your review paper. You need to cover an assessment of the culture. How does all of this affect the culture of your organization? Remember, I talked about codes of conduct, performances, bonuses, those type of things. All of that affects your culture. The kind of a tone from the top down. If the CEO has a lackadaisy approach to customer due diligence and KYC, the rest of the organization will have the same view, right? Who's holding him accountable? The board should hold him accountable, correct? Because one of the things that corporate governance and a proper risk assessment of your organization is who's assessing the CEO and how is that being done? Actually, one of the requirements of the central bank now is that they want to know how your board is assessing the CEO to prevent situations that you have in, like in this particular example that they're giving you here. And on a yearly basis, you have to report how did the board of directors assess the person in charge, and that's being the CEO or managing director. Could be the executive director. It depends on how, whatever that title is, whatever that person, the equivalent is, right? And how we talked about culture. I mean, they gave you quite a few. They talk about the type of culture it is. There's a lot of things there that raised concerns. Sales targets, performances, culture of KYC, for example, right? We looked at, are you risk assessing? Not only from a risk assessment of an enterprise and AML, but also risk rating your clients. And then you have to touch on some of the things that speak to how you're going to risk rate your clients too. So one of the major factors coming out of this is, should he be approving? Should he be approving these clients? The fact that he could approve them is going to affect everything in your business. You can have all the controls in place, but if he can override everybody else, you're going to have a serious issue, eh? All right? And that's why it talks about analyze the AML and customer due diligence risk inherent in the way the firm is operating. You're dealing with high net worth, you're dealing with possible PEPs, and then therefore corruption. We talked about extraterritorial reaches of legislation, not only the US, but the UK, and I can name a whole bunch, France and all kind of other places have the same kind of legislation, right? We're talking about also the legislation which allows you to then have to hold on to the assets if they're from corruption and have to hold them so that they could be returned back to the country which they were stolen from. All right. There's a lot of things. They talk about training. What is the importance of training? Right? One of the things that they had here, which point that was? I think it's point 8 or 9 on these bullet points here, where they talked about okay, hold on. When interviewed, she stated that she had neither the time nor the training for to properly fulfill this role. Well, you could have somebody in a position like that, and that's what they could say? Really? I mean, the Securities Commission talks about the fitness of purpose, right? In terms of, did your money laundering reporting officer, compliance officer fit the purpose? Did they fit the guidelines that's set out by the regulator? If not, they shouldn't even be submitted to be your compliance officer, your money laundering reporting officer. I know for the Securities Commission, they won't be approved, right? Likewise, central banks, that's why you're required to give everything from their police record right on down to their qualification. How often are they being trained? What kind of training is the MLROs getting? The CO, the compliance officer, we have to be just as trained as everybody else. We have to be up on the trends and changes that's happening, the changes in risk. Is it just local training that they're getting, or are you sending them out to conferences? Actually, central bank will ask you to see your training records, and so will the Securities Commission. That should have been part of your enterprise risk assessment, eh? The training that you're giving your staff. Who's required? I mean, well, some training is going to be across the board. That training differs depending also on roles and responsibilities too. And have you has your organization taken that into effect and ensure that those persons are getting the training that is needed? And then they talk about a schedule of recommendations to reduce money laundering and financial crime risks and better protect the firm. We've basically covered everything in just a couple hours. And I summed up those chapters very quickly. So with that said, I am happy to schedule some more time if you need it. Any questions? And that could be from what we discussed to coming out of the actual assessment itself in terms of what you guys are going to have to respond to in the question. No?
Have an email that we can shoot you a quick email if we have a question or concern?
Sure. My email has changed for some of you guys, so I'll give you my personal email. I no longer work where I used to work, and I shall say that my views here are my views and not the views of my employer. But that being said, it's my name, Shasta Moxey, at yahoo.com. So to spell Shasta, S-H-A-S-T-A, Moxey, just Shasta Moxey. So it's S-H-A-S-T-A, Moxey, M-O-X-E-Y, all lowercase, the @ yahoo.com.
Mrs. Trickle Moxey, are you saying we're to send it to this email and it's going forward?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, my dear.
For some of you, I've actually been at my current employer now since last October. The joys. Some of you have had me before. I would have spoken about my previous employer who was famous for wearing a pinstripe suit. And Chanel is laughing because she knows who it is. Okay, so I am hoping that I have equipped you guys with enough information so that you can not only respond to this question, but in looking through the relevant chapters or units, you can put it all in perspective and so as to answer the question. Because that's really all they want you to do in these questions and assessments. They want to see if after so many units, can you really put everything in perspective? If you're thrown into a situation where the subject of the unit applied, can you take the factors and apply them to the situation? That's all they want you to know. It isn't as hard as they make it seem, but that's really what they're trying to do. So that being said, please don't forget they have things about keywords. What I always try to do is read through the question first. And as I read through, I highlight those things that pop out at me. And then I go back through it again to see if the same things pop out at me or did I miss something. And one of the things I like to do, so I don't know if you can see my paper, but I have highlighted and then I have little comments, little things, the arrows coming out from the questions to ask myself things. So like one of the things I asked at the beginning, when it says you are a newly appointed money laundering reporting officer at a medium-sized regulated financial services firm based in a jurisdiction of your choice. Now, why did I say of your choice? Because ICA is global, and so it doesn't have to be the Bahamas or the UK. Obviously, the material is geared towards the UK, although they do try to give you information about and legislation on a balanced view of more than one jurisdiction. It's always easier to talk about your jurisdiction, okay? Because you know what's happening in your jurisdiction better than anybody else, correct? But that would just be my take on that. One of the things I highlighted, because they talk about at the very beginning, you have been asked by the board of directors to undertake a thorough review of the AML policies, procedures, and culture prevalent in the firm. So there's a lot of things we already talked about. Do they have a code of conduct? That would have been part of the risk assessment in terms of the enterprise risk assessment. How are we ensuring that your money laundering, terrorist financing policies and procedures are actually being followed? One of the easiest ways to do that is by ensuring that your company has a code of conduct. And it isn't just a paper code of conduct. You're actually getting people to read it, understand it, you're doing training on it, and you're enforcing it. If you're saying that there are penalties if you you can do some unethical behavior, the unethical behavior should not go unpunished. Because just like little kids, if I could get away with it without any punishment, I will continue to do it. Simple. Happens to everybody. So ask yourself these questions as you go through. I'm trying to see if I missed anything that I want to go to. I will tell you that there are some protections actually going back to, I think it's Chanel's question out there. I know that in today's world, if you were to fire a money laundering reporting officer or compliance officer, you're going to have to explain to the regulator why that person is no longer in that position. So, and they're not going to just interview the firms, they're going to interview the person that got fired. So if that's the money laundering reporting officer, the money laundering reporting officer has the opportunity to say exactly why they were fired. They didn't like me because I was standing up to them and I didn't think a certain thing should be done. Correct? Now, whether or not you want to go back in that firm, if the regulator insists, I personally wouldn't, because that's like going back into hell. But, I say that because those are things that are out there too that would make a company stop and think. And stop and think to say, if my compliance officer, my money laundering reporting officer is saying that my procedures are lacking, and I may have to have a discussion. You all know I have to have a discussion with the inspector twice a year. That's an incentive to cause you to get in line, is it not? So there are a lot of things that you have to look at how they affect everybody, and how can they encourage, is the word that I like to use, encourage firms to ensure that they have a good culture of money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation in place, that they're making sure that they're assessing their risk. We talked about a lot of things that just because you're required to do it by the regulator, as already will create a culture. You know what I mean? I give you an example. So in the commercial world, when you have to make these reports to the central bank, particularly with regard to exchange control, and they start putting those daily fines on you, or where you're supposed to make a report to the Securities Commission at the end of the year and you don't, and you start to get a daily fine, and that daily fine is running up very quickly. I bet you all ain't gonna do that next year. You'll get those reports in on time, eh? And they're gonna be accurate and they're gonna reflect what is needed. So I am available if you need questions. Ask questions. Okay? I'm even here to, if you just need to run something by me with regard to maybe one of the things we talked about today. If you do want more time, let me know. I could set up another class and we could just talk about things that maybe questions that you guys all have. Remember, the question that you have, probably somebody else has in the group too. Okay? And I could be assured that probably somebody else has the same question. They just may be a little timid in asking the question. And you may just be a little bit more bold in saying, yeah, I don't understand that. So your question could help somebody else better than mine. Right, so I think I've kept you guys long enough. I hope it was crystal. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys.
I
Good luck.
have a question.
Sure.
If we did want to schedule another session, how would we go about that?
Just ask Miss Dean.
Okay.
Or Miguel. Ask Miss Dean, because Miss Dean will be more on top of getting it done, and she'll communicate with you. Or send me an email. You guys have my email. Send me an email.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, and I'll make sure it gets done. What is the best time for you guys? I know some of you guys, even in COVID times, are working full days. I work a full day from home, even though I am not going out. I have been since pre-COVID, so let me know what time is best for most of you guys. I was trying to do something on Saturday, but we had some technical issues, Miguel and I, and so I didn't feel that Saturday morning, it would have been fair for you guys to get an email to say, by the way, classes a couple hours from now. Okay? But just let me know. I'm pretty flexible. Okay? I'm going to try and do it in the middle of the day when most of you guys might be working. I understand that you all do have a class that's at 2 or something. That's crazy, but anyway, that's just my view. That's just my view. But if you guys are all free at that time, great. I don't know how many of you are, but I know I wouldn't have been. So just let me know. Okay?
Okay.
Great. Have a great night.
Have a great night.
All right, then.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Get out of this. Okay. started. Um,